Alright, so in this lecture I'm going to give a more supplementary lecture on the week 4 module. So the week 4 module goes over two things. It goes over more about different kinds of essays, and it goes over sentence structure, which is pretty much what I went over for our week 5 quiz prep and our week 4 instructor session, as well as my week 3 module supplement. So this is in addition to your week 4 module, and I'm gonna go over your week 4 module together with you, so that way we can discuss the module when we talk about modules in the forums. And so here, let me go to the next. So the first topic is process analysis. What is a process analysis essay? So if you watched my previous video, you know that a process essay is a how-to essay. In other words, it's an essay that teaches you how to do something, how to get rich, how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So here, Kim's note, process analysis. Would you please help me? I promised my grandma I'd record a program for her, and I can't remember how to use the DVR. Sheila explained over the phone to George, as the time for the start of the program loomed ever closer. Realizing Sheila was stressed about letting her grandma down, even though he had explained this process to her several times before, George decided he would walk her through the process one last time. And then he was going to write the steps down for her so she would reference them in the future. And so here they're introducing a how should she use the DVR. And so how to use a DVR, step 1, step 2, step 3, that's known as a process analysis essay. Any kind of how-to. What is process analysis writing? Process analysis consists of explaining step by step how to accomplish an end result. Remember, academic essays must be written in proper sentence format, so these steps must be written in complete sentences. When George writes his process analysis for Sheila, in order to follow an academic format, he would perhaps start with a paragraph that explains why he is writing out the process steps, followed by a paragraph that explains the steps for Sheila to follow. So that would be in order, so your thesis statement would be, in order to work a DVR, you need to step 1, step 2, step 3. And then step 1, step 2, step 3 will become your body paragraphs. And remember that when you write your body paragraphs, the topic sentences, that is the first sentence of each paragraph, needs to match your thesis statement. So here they're going to give an example of this. And so the steps I have to follow in order to record on my DVR aren't difficult, but I can't seem to remember them when I need them. Let me think. What would be the very first step in my process analysis essay? Process analysis must include every step necessary to complete our end result. No step can be left out, or the reader will not be able to accomplish the task. It is always a good idea to warn the reader if a step is extremely difficult or important or difficult to accomplish. Processes often include steps that are easy for us to remember but difficult for other people, so we must be vigilant to write down every step necessary. Make sure to do the questioning Tom is doing when coming up with the steps for your process analysis. Don't forget, practice writing a process analysis just like Kim did. Include every step required, start to finish, and warn your readers if any particular step is especially important or difficult to accomplish. Make sure to follow all the grammar and spelling rules because your steps must be written in complete sentences. Select multiple sentences that describe a step in a process or warn the reader of a step that is difficult or important. Well, I'm not going to go over this, but this is an example of what would be a typical topic sentence for a step. Before you start, be sure to both the DVR and the TV are turned on. If you pass the railroad tracks, you've gone too far. George has trouble remembering how to get to Sheila's house. carefully measure out 1 cup of flour. And so here, which one of these sentences describe to you how something is done? So obviously, if you're teaching someone how to do a DVR, this one would be right. If you're teaching someone how to directions to a house, okay, this would be a step. And if you're teaching someone a recipe to make something, cookies, then this would be a step. All right. So these are all examples of steps. So in a process analysis, clear, detailed instructions must be given, and the reader must be warned of any potential difficulties. Narration. And so narration is, you just simply tell a story. And in this class is a narration about a story about your life. But it could be also a story that you see in a book, a story that you see on TV, or a story, any kind of story. And we're going to go over what is narration, how to tell a good story. So when you tell a good story, the purpose is to impart a lesson or central point through a story or stories. Okay, so if you watch my if you watch my video on what is narrative essay, I go over 2 kinds or 3 kinds, 3 kinds of narrative essays. You can write a 1-story essay, and I think I went over the guy that threw up on his wife. That was the 1-story essay. Or you can write a multi-story narrative essay in which you write, I became a nurse because, and then you write a series of reasons, and then you write a series of stories within the reasons. And so the purpose of both kinds of the 1-story narration as well as a multi-story narrative essay is to give people a lesson, to teach people a lesson. By telling your story, you teach a lesson. That's the purpose of your narrative essay. And I will tell you that in Chinese literature is full of fables, and each story illustrates a moral to teach Chinese kids right and wrong. And if you read a lot of fables, European fables as well, the main purpose of those stories is also to teach kids a lesson. For instance, Little Red Riding Hood. You shouldn't be trusting that wolf because he's going to eat you, so don't trust strangers. So that's teaching kids not to trust strangers in Little Red Riding Hood, for instance. And so there are a lot of stories that impart a lesson is a very traditional way, traditional reason for people to write a story. And so for your first essay, you're going to also write a story that teaches a lesson. Then when you write an essay, you have to be aware of your audience. Who are you writing the essay for? Are you writing the essay for kids? Are you writing the essay for adults? Are you writing the essay for experts? Or are you writing the essay for novices? And you're going to write differently for each audience, okay? And so here, when you write a story, you want a conflict with which the audience can easily identify with, and that the audience can enjoy colorful yet meaningful details that lend to the lesson. And you got to avoid rambling, okay? So that's why we're learning the 5-paragraph essay structure, so that you stay on topic and you don't go off topic. And so you need to use dialogue in your narrative essay in order for your narrative essay to come alive. So for your essay 1, dialogue is part of your rubric. And so dialogue has its own rules. And so dialogue can be used to reveal character. It may be effective to move the plot. Dialogue may be useful to show what the character is thinking. And it may be a tool to inform the reader about background events. So there are many different uses for dialogue. When I write stories, most of my stories consists of dialogue. And for me, dialogue reveals the character. So if I were to say something like, I ain't very hungry today, what does that dialogue reveal? It reveals that that particular character comes from the South. how would you reveal the accent in writing? Well, then that's the only time in an essay that you can write incorrect grammar. You would write A-I-N-T, ain't hungry. So right away you know he's from the South and he doesn't know proper grammar. And so when we write incorrect grammar in dialogue, that's okay, because then you're using that to reveal the character and reveal where he comes from. And then if you want to move the plot, dialogue is much more interesting than reading about it. So if I say, John found a red house down the block. Oh, that's so boring. So you would say, John says, hey, Jane, did you know what house I saw down the block? I think we're going to love living there. You're going to love the color. And then Jane would say, did you find a red house? You know, that's my favorite color. And then Jane would say, or the other character would say, yes, I found a red house just for you. Okay, anyway, so I used dialogue to tell the reader that the character found a red house. So, which is more interesting? If I were to simply say, he found a red house down the block, or if I made it into dialogue. So you can use dialogue to move the plot. It may be useful to show what a character is thinking. And so instead of writing, John thinks that this lecture is boring. So instead, you would say, as John was sitting in the lecture, he had many thoughts bubble in his head. He looked at the teacher, and he thought that, oh my God, this teacher looks like he's about to fall asleep with his own lecture. And as the character looked at the audience, the other students, he thought, wow, these students look like they're falling asleep too. And why does this professor just drone on and on and on? I could be doing something much more interesting, like swimming in my swimming pool, than having to listen to this boring lecture. So when you reveal what a character is thinking, that's much more interesting than saying that lecture is boring. And that when you reveal what a character is thinking, that's known as interior monologue. Shakespeare uses interior monologue all the time in his plays. So if you are a fan of Shakespeare, you know how well Shakespeare used that ploy of interior monologue to move his plot along. Like when you have the king and he's thinking about killing somebody, and he has all of these sinister thoughts. Okay, so it's very useful to show. Dialogue is very useful to show what the character is thinking. And then a dialogue can also be used to inform the reader about background events. So if you don't know the backstory of something, then you could have one character saying something like, really? Jane is an alcoholic? I had no idea. Then the other character would say something like, oh my God, Jane has been with AAA Jane has been with Alcoholics Anonymous forever. But it took, and then he would tell the whole story about Jane, the alcoholism, how she joined the, Alcoholics Anonymous, and then how Jane now is sober. I'm not going to go into, but then you get the backstory. So dialogue can also be used to tell a backstory. And so some basic dialogue, basic rules. So I went over this for your week 5 quiz. Is you need to place a quotation mark around the words of a dialogue. You start a new paragraph when a different character speaks. Make your dialogue realistic. And you can use slang and grammar errors, and you don't have to have good punctuation in a dialogue. Why is this the case? Because this reveals that the character in the story is uneducated. You can make it clear to your reader who is speaking at all times. And then accompany dialogue tags with a comma. A dialogue tag is if I say something like, John says, that's a dialogue tag, and then comma. John says, and then in parentheses, this is a boring lecture. And then period. Period first, then the quotation mark. Then the next person goes, says, and then Jane says, comma, parentheses, you that sure is a boring lecture. You are so right. Anyway, that's the idea. Developing narration through pre-writing. And so we did this during our week 2 pre-writing. So listing means that you list everything you can think about that topic. Free writing is you just write out whatever comes to your head in paragraph format so that you can see what it is you want to use for your essay. So pre-writing is the first step in the writing process. 3 steps to your writing process is pre-writing, writing, and rewriting. So when you want to develop narration through revision, create a scratch outline of a free write so that you can better see unity and organization. This means that you can create an outline by doing mapping, and then in the central circle you put in your main idea, and then in the outer circles you put in your body paragraphs. In other words, how are you going to prove that main idea? Then you can peer review. In other words, let somebody else read your paper so that other people can give you, oh, you made a mistake in grammar. Oh, that's not very clear. Your thesis statement is in the wrong place. So this is what's going to happen in your week 5 forum during the peer review, is when everybody looks over everyone else's paper so that we can improve our papers together. Because sometimes when we revise our own papers, we're too close to it. We think our papers, everybody has an ego. Everybody thinks their paper is great. There are no mistakes until someone else looks at it, because it's not their ego involved. So share your text with a peer for constructive feedback. Sentence structure. I'm going to really go over a lot of sentence structure for your week 7 quiz, but I did kind of an introduction to sentence structure for your week 5 quiz when I went over comma usage. And I went over what is a simple sentence, subject, verb, object. What is a compound sentence? That's fanboys, and you got to have a comma in the middle. And then what is a complex sentence is when you have a dependent clause together with an independent clause. And then I said that when a dependent clause is at the beginning of the sentence, you use a comma. When the dependent clause is at the end of the sentence, you don't need a comma, with the exception of that, which, who, and whose. Okay, and so when you use that, which, who, and whose, adjective clauses, totally different set of rules in which, and I went over this, if you listen to my week 4 instructor session, you'll totally understand what I'm talking about. Otherwise, you're lost. Okay, so we went over a little bit of sentence structure with comma usage. And so here I'm going to go over, can I write a sentence without a subject? During conversation, it should be okay, but I don't know in writing. And so we already know that if you write a sentence without a subject, you have a sentence fragment, because every complete sentence has to have a subject, verb, and object. And basically in this particular week 4 lecture I didn't write this lecture, this is from the school. But anyway, this week 4 lecture talks about how a simple sentence is constructed of a subject, and then which is what does the action in the sentence, and then the verb and object, which is known as the predicate. In other words, that's what happens to the subject. So every simple sentence has to have subject, verb, object, and then the verb and the object is the predicate. So sentence structure is very important in college writing and professional communication as well. So if you talk in sentence fragments, people will know right away you don't know your grammar. So here is every sentence must contain 2 basic parts, a subject and a predicate. Subjects. The subject of a sentence can be a person, place, or thing. Simple subject. The noun or pronoun that names what the sentence is about. Example, the dog is barking. So here you have the subject, the dog, because the subject is always whatever is doing the action, especially in active voice. Okay, I'll go over active and passive voice. I think I went over that during the week 1 quiz. So if you remember, active voice is when the subject does the action. So complete subject, and then passive voice is when the subject receives the action. So that is one of the aspects of a verb. A complete subject, the simple subject plus its modifier. So the modifier, mangy old, as we already went over the parts of speech in your week 3 quiz. So mangy old is adjectives. Whenever you have an adjective, the adjective mangy old always modifies the noun dog. Predicate. A predicate indicates what the subject does. In other words, what happens to the subject or what is said about the subject. In other words, a predicate comes after the subject. It's whatever comes after the subject. It's everything after the subject is a predicate. That's the simplest way to remember that. So simple predicate. That is the main verb along with its helping verb. And so here, example, Mia is helping her mom in the kitchen. So that the subject of the sentence is Mia. Everything else is a predicate. That's the easiest way to understand what a predicate is, okay? In other words, Mia is the subject, and then everything else is a predicate. A complete predicate is when you say Janet is singing on the stage for the first time. So everything else that comes after your subject is a predicate. And then a compound predicate is when you have Jason lives in China and speaks Mandarin. In other words, you have 2 verbs. And whenever you have 2 of anything, that's what compound means. Compound sentence means 2 sentences. Compound subject means 2 verbs. Compound verbs means 2 verbs. And then compound predicate simply means you have 2 predicates. So compound everything means 2 of something. And so objects. A direct object is a noun or pronoun that receives the action of a verb. And so whenever you have a direct object is something that comes directly after the verb. So here you have the subject John, because John is what does the action. Loves. Loves, verb is always the action. So John loves, and then John loves traveling to Europe. Remember, that whole thing is known as a predicate. And then here, if we want to break up the predicate, a predicate has a subject and an object. And so here, loves is the subject. Traveling to Europe, this whole thing is a gerund object. Oh, you don't have to know about gerunds yet. Okay, so this is just a direct object because a direct object comes directly after the verb. An indirect object is a pronoun or noun that names the person or thing to whom or for whom something is done. And so when you have an indirect object, you have some kind of preposition or you have something else that comes after the verb, then you have your object. Okay, in other words, it's not directly after the verb. So here, the man on the bench tossed the pigeons some crumbs. And so here, the man on the bench, the man is the subject. On a bench is the prepositional phrase. Remember, prepositional phrase shows time and place. It shows where something is, or when, in other words, under the desk, on top of the desk, next to the desk. That's a prepositional phrase. Tossed is the verb, and then this whole thing, tossed the pigeons some crumbs, that whole thing is a predicate. And then here, tossed the pigeons is the indirect object. The direct object is tossed. This I would need to write it out in order to get you to understand. So here you can write the man tossed some crumbs to the pigeons. So normally that's how it is. So when I say to the pigeons, this is the indirect object. So I think that this will be a good place for me to teach you about, let's see if I can get this to work. No, I don't want to lose this. Okay. Anyway, so the difference between a phrase, but I will go over what is a direct object and an indirect object in another lesson in a much clearer way. But just basically understand that you have, here you have John loves traveling to Europe. In other words, this whole thing comes directly after the verb. That's a direct object. And here, this does not come directly after the verb. In other words, the man tossed some crumbs to the pigeons. And so that is the most correct way to say that, when you say tossed to the pigeons some crumbs. So the to in this sentence is understood. And so whenever you have some kind of preposition that comes in between the object and the verb, then you have an indirect object. And so here they didn't make that very clear about to the pigeon, okay? So that's understood. In very correct English, in conversational English, we take out the to and just say, toss the pigeons some crumbs. So that is very tricky. It's just like when I taught you the reduced adjective clauses. So instead of saying, while I was growing up, I always wanted to become a nurse. While growing up, I wanted to become a nurse. Growing up, I wanted to become a nurse. And you notice that while I was suddenly disappeared. Well, that's the same thing as this. The to disappears because of conversational English. Through time, people started to just reduce because people are so lazy when they talk. And this is the natural evolution of the language if you study linguistics. So here, the to the pigeons is understood. So that's why pigeons is an indirect object. The difference between a phrase and a clause. A phrase is a group of words that has no subject and no verb, okay? And so it cannot stand alone as a sentence. So things like go to bed, or if I have a prepositional phrase, under the desk, okay? Any kind of phrase. And so if I say under the desk, that lacks a subject, it lacks a verb, or it lacks both. And so that's known as a phrase. So prepositional phrase is an example. Or go to bed, that's also a phrase. A clause is a group of words that has a subject and a verb. So that's why we can say a dependent clause, because a dependent clause, while John chews the gum, John chews. John is the subject, choose is the verb. So a clause is any group of words that has a subject and a verb. And you can have two kinds of clauses. You can have an independent clause, which is a complete sentence, or you can have a dependent clause, which is not a complete sentence. And so when you have an independent clause together with a dependent clause in one sentence, that's known as a complex sentence. So here, when the puppies were born, that's a dependent clause because you have this subordinating conjunction when. That's why I always tell students, you need to have your own list of subordinating conjunctions. So that way you can have proper comma usage. You know that it's a dependent clause and you know that it's a complex sentence. So that's what knowing something is a subordinating conjunction does for your writing. And so know that you have two different kinds of clauses, an independent clause and a dependent clause. An independent clause means that it's a complete sentence, it's a thought that can stand on its own. So if I say that the owner examined them carefully, this is an independent clause. So yes, that can stand by itself. But as soon as you add a subordinating conjunction, that makes the sentence dependent and a sentence fragment, all at the same time. And so when you have a dependent clause, it cannot stand by itself, and that it's not a complete sentence, not a complete thought, and it's incorrect grammar, and you are going to lose points if you write a lot of sentence fragments in your essay. So that's why it's important to understand sentence structure. It's important to understand what is a complete sentence. It's important to understand that there are three kinds of sentences in English: simple sentence, compound sentence, and complex sentence, which I'm going to go over in a lot of detail when I teach you your week 7 quiz. Not this one. This week 5 quiz focuses on punctuation, mainly mechanics. So which one has correct grammar? A doctor or a nurse will explain the lab results. The postal worker, bitten by a dog. Reporter should the subjects of their stories for comment. And so if you're a native speaker of English, you should be able to hear which one makes sense and which one doesn't make sense. If you're an ESL student, in other words, English is not your first language, then you should be good enough at grammar to know that this is the correct answer, because here you have a subject, a doctor or a nurse. Will explain is the verb, and the object, the lab results. So this is correct grammar because it has a subject, a verb, a helping verb, a main verb, and a direct object. This is a sentence fragment because you have to say the postal worker was bitten by a dog, passive voice. So remember that passive voice always has be plus the past participle. And then the subject receives the action of being bitten by the dog. So that is passive voice. And I always tell students they should use active voice, not passive voice, in their essay. So this is wrong because it's missing was bitten. Here, they're missing a main verb. Reporters should write about the subjects of their stories for comment, or should talk about. In other words, it's just missing some kind of main verb, a helping verb, okay, here. Because should is a helping verb, and then it's missing a main verb, okay? So this one, he's got both the helping verb and the main verb, and this one's missing a main verb. So that's incorrect. So here we submit, and we got the correct answer. And that's the end of, obviously, of this particular lecture. So I hope that you enjoyed my commentaries on your week 4 lecture, and I hope that this inspires you to actually watch the video and actually read the modules, because I've noticed that many students don't read their interactive lecture. They also don't read their textbook, because when I ask questions about the module, interactive module, or I would say, what is your favorite part of the week 4 interactive lecture? Or what is your favorite part of the week 3 reading? I usually get crickets, as in silence. So that tells me that nobody's been doing their textbook reading, and that nobody's been reading their week 4 interactive lecture, which actually has a lot of good information about writing. So that's why I'm making these videos, in the hopes that somebody will actually watch the video, and then when I ask you questions, reading comprehension questions in the forums, you have some kind of answer. Like my favorite part was when Professor H talked about direct objects or some such thing. This tells me that you read the text. If I get crickets, then I think, okay, that student did not read anything and is too busy to learn what is in the class. So I'm hoping that everybody listens to this video and learns good writing. So that would be the end of this video. If you have any questions, if you want me to elongate even more on any of the topics in this module, feel free to email me.